What's up, everybody? This is Karak with ACG, and welcome to the Gaming Minute, where I try to cover news from last week or this week, all with a 1-minute maximum time limit. The first bit of news I want to cover today is that Marvel's Spider-Man Turf Wars DLC is going to arrive November 20th, 2018. Now, the last DLC actually got pretty good reviews, but was a little bit short, and some people were discussing whether they really felt that that length was something that should have been mixed into the actual game or not. So this will be the second attempt at the DLC. I'm excited to see what it is. It also includes 3 new suits, which I'm not going to spoil here, but they have ended up showing in various different places. Also, this DLC continues to be $9.99 alone, or you can buy it for $24.99 for the bundle itself. Next up, in a little bit more tragic news, sadly, Marvel icon Stan Lee ended up dying yesterday at age 95. A lot of people who've worked with Stan Lee came forward on Twitter and discussed the ways he impacted their life. One of the things that's interesting is if you look at the wiki page, you can see just how many characters Stan Lee actually created. And additionally, you can also notice that some of those were a little bit later in his life, not necessarily in the last couple years, but certainly something that shows that through his entire span of over 60 years, he really did end up creating, well, basically the cornerstone of all comics. Next up is something I've talked about before, which is Red Dead 2. Now, EA Motive's senior tech animator Dan Lowe, he's done some other comparisons on some other games for different things. He did a comparison for Arthur in Red Dead 2 compared to some other games, and it's quite interesting when you look at these numbers. Now, this was just movement. It wasn't pressing the A button or firing, but you can see here the numbers, and they're actually quite interesting for how long it takes between frames of when you move that gamepad and the game actually reacts when it comes to movement itself. Of course, whether this bothers you or not is sort of regardless of the fact. This is just something that was an experiment for him to do in a comparison. This is also a comparison that many of you can do at home, and you can find different tutorials online for how to do that. And next up, let's talk about something a little bit near and dear to my heart, which is Supermassive Games working on multiple PlayStation exclusives. This was interesting because we do know that their Man of Medan game is going to be released on multiple platforms. But when they were doing an interview, they said this, and this information comes from PSU.com. And the interview is actually with the executive director, Pete Samuels. And he says, well, the relationship with Sony is still excellent. We're working on several unannounced PS exclusives. True, it is impossible to talk about them in detail. In general, I really wanted to present our work to the widest possible audience. That is, the Dark Pictures needs to be released on several platforms. And that's the end of his quote. Of course, Until Dawn Rush of Blood, a PSVR game, was released, which was sort of a side story to Until Dawn itself. But one of the things a lot of people have been wondering is, does this indicate more of a PSVR slant for their PlayStation exclusives? And that really wouldn't surprise me, especially because they've been pretty heady on their like for the PSVR, and Sony has made sure it's clear that they're spending money on exclusives. This is something that I'm going to be watching closely because despite some technical issues I had with Until Dawn when it first got released, once it was patched up, that game is really enjoyable to a lot of people, and I certainly can see how this would be a boon for not only PlayStation 4, but again, PSVR. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Gamepass. So at this last event, Microsoft stated a couple times, not only in the main event, but in interviews later, where they basically stated that putting games out on Game Pass has elicited this buying spree from gamers who end up purchasing those, despite the fact that it really doesn't match up with the original idea of how many games the title would sell if it was sold as a normal release. I can say this really isn't surprising at all, especially when you look at the number of gamers who can get Game Pass for $1 or $10 and jump into all these titles for basically that cost. Many people are going to end up liking these games, especially when your expectations are really aimed at that $1 or $10 price range for all these games. Additionally, when you look at it and break it down, you can certainly see that this could help multiplayer games. A good example of this would, of course, be Onrush, which was a racing title that came out recently. Some people really liked it. Other people weren't really in love with it. But when you look at the server count and how low it dropped, how quickly it dropped, this is something that with Game Pass, you have these titles available the entire time. People have a higher chance of jumping into them. I think when you look at State of Decay 2, it's really surprising there because even though I had some bugs, I liked it, but it was buggy. That's usually something that gamers are more tentative on. But they've made it clear that State of Decay 2 launched, and it was absolutely incredible numbers. Far greater than, again, they would have got had they released this as a normal title alone. This is also backed up by the NPD numbers that were released when State of Decay 2 came out. Admittedly, this was a heavy news week, but those were the elements I wanted to cover. We also had the fact that Microsoft ended up purchasing 2 companies that they announced at this last event, and of course, Activision and Bungie having a bit of a disagreement about Destiny 2, but those have been covered by other people, so I figured these were some of the things not necessarily covered by everybody out there. I want to know what you guys think about the news, what you guys think about interesting news this week. If you have something that I missed or something that I just didn't want to cover and you want to talk about it, feel free to put that in the comments. Give it a thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you didn't. Of course, you can become a patron on the Patreon website, which helps me give you guys news and reviews that isn't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your week.